how to increase your breath hold for spearfishing. There's a lot of information to cover in this episode, and a lot of it's very important to know, particularly around the dangers involved in breath hold diving. What we're going to do is start with the common causes of fatality while spearfishing, as this information is crucial to know when you're getting into the sport. After we cover off these aspects, I'll move into breathing and relaxation techniques that will help you to increase your breath hold, and it will allow you to do that effectively and safely. After this, we'll move on to proactive equalizing, duck diving, finning and posture, important surfacing habits, and also training tables, and I go into diet a little bit as well. So let's start from the beginning, the urge to breathe. A large part of increasing your breath hold efficiently is understanding a few basics around breathing. Firstly, I'd like to start off by explaining what the urge to breathe actually is. It would make sense to think that a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream would drive our urge to breathe, but in fact the majority of the receptors in the respiratory center in the human brain ignore oxygen levels and react to carbon dioxide levels in the blood. To put it simply, high levels of carbon dioxide in the blood cause us to be incredibly uncomfortable, even if we still have plenty of available oxygen left in the lungs. With this in mind, when we are trying to increase our breath hold, we're training for CO2 tolerance, to tolerate higher levels of carbon dioxide in our bloodstream. Increasing your carbon dioxide tolerance will delay the urge to breathe in a safe way. Now, this brings me on to my next topic, overbreathing. The technical term for overbreathing is hyperventilation, and it is not only very common in spearfishing, but it is dangerous and it can lead to loss of motor control and a shallow water blackout. A lot of people do not realize that any type of breathing that varies from homeostasis, or what is considered normal breathing, such as several deep breaths prior to descent, is considered hyperventilation. The result of overbreathing is a rapid decrease of CO2 levels in the bloodstream. And as we mentioned before, CO2 is responsible for the urge to breathe. Now, this practice of overbreathing, it cheats our body and pushes out the urge to breathe. So that brings us far closer to running out of available oxygen. Now, that running out of oxygen can lead to what we call cerebral hypoxia, which can cause a diver to black out completely or lose all motor control. Now, proper breathing techniques prior to diving and also after surfacing are not only incredibly useful for gauging your own body and knowing your real limits, but they're crucial to avoiding a potentially fatal blackout. And this is really important in spearfishing because we're not just free diving and trying to push our depth limits. We're going down there and we've got a job to do. We're actively hunting, dealing with, adrenaline, buck fever. We're not essentially free divers. We are hunters, and it's a very different discipline. Obviously, knowing your real limits is crucial to avoiding a potentially fatal blackout. Now, I'll move on to the proper breathing up and post-dive techniques for spearfishing shortly. However, I'd first like to talk about shallow water blackout. There are two main dangerous types of scenario associated with cerebral hypoxia, or in simple terms, lack of oxygen to the brain, which we have to be well aware of in the sport of freedive spearfishing. Now, the first is samba, or loss of motor control, named samba after the full body shaking that is often witnessed during one of these episodes. The second is shallow water blackout, where the diver completely loses consciousness and will drown without the aid of another diver. I will mention here that a samba can also lead to a drowning just as easily. Now, these events typically happen upon ascent, where the diver has used up their available oxygen throughout the dive and there is not enough available oxygen to maintain consciousness. Now, depending where the blackout occurs in the water column and how the diver is weighted, the diver may sink back towards the bottom and suffer barotrauma or burst eardrums from not being able to equalize while sinking. A diver that is not assisted back to the surface in time may end up with brain damage or will not survive the blackout. So the clip that you're watching now is obviously a real dramatic bit of blackout footage, and it sort of hits home, the danger of blackout quite well. The diver in the clip, he's fine. He came to after a couple of minutes and was just a bit shaken. He's just really lucky that his buddy was there to get him. And apparently the cause of this one was chasing fish at the end of the breath, which is a very common one. So that's something that as spearfishermen we have to really keep in mind. We can sort of forget that we need to breathe. So yeah, I'll mention at this point that when we spearfish, we remove the snorkel from our mouths prior to diving, as we do not want this acting as a pathway for water to enter the lungs upon blackout, and also the bubbles exiting the snorkel are noisy and can scare some species of fish. Now, besides overbreathing, there are a couple of factors at play when it comes to blackout, such as the vacuum effect and some people's genetic tendency to tolerate higher levels of carbon dioxide. Not to mention chasing fish at the end of your breath and fighting fish underwater. Now, as you descend, your lungs compress, forcing oxygen into the bloodstream, and as you ascend, the lungs re-expand, reversing this process. Now, this is what's called the vacuum effect, and this is why blackout is commonly seen in the last 5 or so meters of the ascent. As the lungs are expanding, drawing oxygen from the bloodstream, the brain switches off with no prior warning. Now, this is a protection mechanism caused by lack of available oxygen. If the diver does not get oxygen back into their system, brain damage can begin to occur after several minutes. It pays to note that it is often not new divers who suffer from blackout, but divers who have worked on increasing their CO2 tolerance and are pushing their own physical limits. This is why trying to outsmart the brain's breathing center by overbreathing is a dangerous practice, and having the peace of mind of knowing the correct techniques can really help you relax while spearfishing. Shallow water blackout is the main reason why the 1 up, 1 down rule is encouraged in the spearfishing community, and I'll explain that now. The 1 up, 1 down rule is fairly self-explanatory. One diver is on the surface using their surface interval time to make sure that their dive buddy makes it back to the surface with no issues. And we will cover surface intervals later in this episode. Once the first diver has surfaced, it is safe then for the other diver to descend and so forth, giving the peace of mind that if anyone encounters a problem, there is a bit of a safety net in place. This type of diving is incredibly important, especially for bottom or weed line diving, where you may have to wait a long time for fish to approach. It is not only beneficial for safety reasons, but it also helps you relax into diving and hunting better, knowing that you have someone waiting for you on the surface. During the 1 up, 1 down technique, there are signs to look for in your dive buddy as he or she ascends. Now, often people on the verge of trouble begin to fin strangely. They may release bubbles from their mouth, they may release their weight belt or drop their spear gun, or other more subtle signs. So it pays to take note that a diver can take a breath and then begin to samba or black out. So watching your buddy on the surface after a dive is actually crucial, as there is a period between the time you inhale and the time oxygen reaches the brain. Now, I'll go over a technique that should be made into a habit for aiding oxygen saturation on the surface shortly. The majority of successful outcomes in a blackout scenario have come about by a dive buddy aiding the unconscious diver to the surface. In some cases, this may mean dropping the victim's weight belt, removing their mask, and keeping their airway unobstructed. Often gently rubbing on the unconscious person's cheeks and blowing on their face and telling them to wake up will eventually lead to them regaining consciousness and breathing again. It is also important to note that yelling at a blacked out diver can put them into a state of shock, so remaining as calm as possible is the key. It does pay to note that depending on the amount of time a diver has been unconscious, that resuscitation may be required, and learning this type of first aid is incredibly beneficial when practicing sports such as freedive spearfishing. Now, I need to highlight that prevention of shallow water blackout is by far the most effective tool against it, and this is how we gear our approach to freediving to hunt fish. So for anyone getting into the sport or any new diver that is seeing improvements in their freediving ability, I would strongly recommend practicing a shallow water blackout rescue under supervision with someone who has experience in the field. Often freediving clubs or local spearfishing stores will have pool times where this type of thing is practiced, and it will involve the releasing of a submerged diver's weight belt, swimming them back to the surface while blocking their airway, and techniques to aid a blacked out diver in regaining consciousness, all while safety divers or lifeguards keep watch. I would like to point out that it appears that some people are more susceptible to blackout. This may be a side effect of a naturally high CO2 tolerance and, a whole myriad of other genetic factors. I'd also like to point out that in the past there has been a school of thought that if you push yourself to blackout, then you learn your limits. This is a very dangerous approach. We don't want our body or brain to learn blackout as a protective behavior when we're sort of in situations where high concentrations of carbon dioxide are in the bloodstream. And as you progress in the sport, you'll become more aware of the topic and the information surrounding it. Now, I'd like to tack on here the reality of the one up, one down rule. The reality is that the majority of the time that it is not followed, and it's I'm going to say where I think it has its place in spearfishing. Some people will disagree. Some people will say always do it. Some people will say never do it, it's pointless. And some people will say have a bit of a mixture. Now, this is my own personal opinion. I've seen quite a few blackouts, and I've seen brand new divers blacking out in pools. Those people that generally have that tendency to go towards blackout, they're a high risk person, and I would, if I was that person that blacks out under those normal sort of circumstances, then I would always be doing one up, one down while spearfishing. Generally, when I'm hunting snapper, that's all solo. Snapper are quite shallow in comparison to where I can comfortably hunt. So, and we're doing quite a lot of work during these dives. They're not one up, one down dives. They're very long horizontal swims. And the one up, one down rule during this type of hunting, length hunting, as opposed to depth hunting, is very impractical. Okay, so I'll let you know where I do my one up, one down rules. And where I think that they're crucial. It becomes a real danger when you start to push your own physical limits. Now, if I'm pushing my own physical limits and I'm going to a depth